Welcome back. If you weren't with us last time, the hope of this video series is to work through some questions and objections that people have to the Christian faith so that we might feel better equipped as we're sharing Jesus with others and as we're wrestling with our own doubts to be prepared to give a defense for the hope that we have. Last week, we set the stage for the discussion by talking about how we need to keep the gospel the main thing and be Christ-like and find common grace connection points as we answer people's questions. This week, we're going to start digging into those questions. But in many ways, this week is also doing a little bit of setting the stage. And the reason for that is that we as Christians need to understand, as we are talking to people in the world, that the world in a lot of ways is changing, and our sense of where people are doesn't always match anymore with reality. Here's what I mean. People who study this kind of thing say that there's cycles over hundreds of years often, but these cycles that different cultures can go through. And you can kind of divide those cultures into three groups. There are pre-Christian cultures. Those cultures have not yet had widespread proclamation of the gospel. And those pre-Christian cultures can definitely be hostile to Christianity in some ways, especially as they're committed to other religious systems. But they tend to be curious at the same time. There's this sort of, I've never met a Christian before. I've never at least heard from someone who believes it about what it is that Christians believe. So often in pre-Christian cultures, as much as there are challenges, there are also real opportunities for communicating the gospel. Then there are what people would call Christianized cultures. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the culture is a Christian, or even that the majority of people are. But it does mean that the gospel has been proclaimed widely enough and the church has spread enough that Christianity is a known factor within that culture. That doesn't mean that everyone has still heard the gospel. In fact, within Christianized cultures, you still very much need to be doing evangelism and teaching people about the good news of Jesus. But it does mean that some of the basic ideas are going to be familiar to people. Oftentimes, it means that they're going to have sort of, in a Christianized culture, a sort of positive view of the church or of Christianity. And there's going to be just more common ground. And then there are post-Christian cultures. Those are cultures that have reached a point where the church has grown, but the church in many ways has become stagnant or become compromised. And there can be different reasons that it happens, but basically, while there are still Christians, maybe even many, many Christians in the culture, the broader culture moves to a point where it says of Christianity, we know what that's about and we're kind of done with it. We've moved on to other things. We don't believe that anymore. That is a culture that you would find in Europe, not in much of the rest of the world, but you do very much find a post-Christian culture in Europe. And that increasingly is the sort of culture that you find in the United States as well, especially in cities like ours. Again, that's not monolithic. There are still lots of people that might be devoted Christians and lots of other people that aren't, but that might exist within a kind of Christianized world because their parents were Christians or they still grew up in some ways or even occasionally attend church. But because of that rise of post-Christianity, which is what some people also call secularism, because of that rise of secularism, we have to, in many ways, rethink how we engage with evangelism and with answering people's questions because we live in that post-Christian world. There's a couple of things that specifically means for how we engage with people talking about the Christian faith. One is that it means that we will no longer have a shared understanding of foundational ideas. One of the issues that I think Christians run into is that they feel like these basic ideas like marriage or the goodness of families or gender working a certain way, they feel like they had these notions, some of which are Christian and some of which are probably connected to their own culture, but that they had those things in common with the world around them, that even though the world didn't have a full Christian view, it was generally like, yeah, that sounds about right. And today, instead, they face misunderstanding, even hostility, and that's because the world just isn't thinking about those things in the same way that we are. Living in a post-Christian world also means that it's no longer the case that most of the people around us would view Christianity or religion in general as a positive social force. It used to be that say someone like me as a pastor, people would look at and say, oh, that's a respectable profession. It was pastors and doctors and lawyers. And I don't really want to return to that. I'm not gunning to try to be viewed the way that a doctor is, and lawyers have kind of, for other reasons, fallen off that train. But it is the case that people would have been like, oh, like you go to church, that's not really for me, but that's good for you. Whereas today, increasingly, people feel like Christianity is a force for bigotry and for social harm and discrimination and is pushing a backward social agenda, things like that. So those are realities of living in a post-Christian world. But the one that I want us to focus on today, because it connects to the question in some ways we're going to try to answer, is that the other issue is that people no longer view Christianity or religion in general as something they might need. One of the things that you'll realize if you spend time around a lot of secular folks, and I've had a number of friends that in many ways are really post-Christian, but one of the biggest hurdles you realize to talking with them about Jesus is not that they're hostile to the Christian faith, but just that they're disinterested in general. They have no sense that it would meaningfully speak to their life. There's nothing about it that would strike them as interesting or appealing or something that would speak to the struggles that they experience. And so before you can start answering their objections to Christianity, in many ways you have to answer the more foundational question of why should I care? Why should I care about Christianity in the first place? Not why should I believe it, but why should I even consider it as something that would be relevant to my life? So that's the question I want to try to answer in a couple of different ways. But I want to be really doubled down clear about what we're doing here, because sometimes people use some of the things that we say in an inappropriate way. So none of what I'm going to say, except a little bit the last point, but certainly the first 3 points that I'm going to make about why we should care about Christianity are not actually arguments for it being true. They could all be true, and Christianity could still be make-believe. We're not trying to convince people of the truth of Christianity, but what we're trying to convince people of is that there's something about it that is intriguing, or that would speak to their practical life, or that would impact the world in a way that should make them care about it. But with that said, here are some reasons to care. One, Christianity and religion in general is growing across the world. Christianity and religion in general is growing across the world. And I mean as a percentage of the population. People who identify as non-religious in terms of the global population are actually shrinking in size, and all of the people that study it project that they'll probably continue to shrink in the next 50 years. There is a myth that's been around for the last 100 or so years. It's the sort of myth of the secularization of the world, which is that as countries become more modernized and as countries become more educated, they will become less religious and more secular. And the reason that myth feels like it has some persuasive force is because to some extent it's been true in parts of Europe, especially Western Europe, and in the United States. Now it's still murky because even there the question of what do you mean by secular gets a little complicated. One of the interesting things is that in the US, while a huge number of people increasingly identify as not affiliated with any religion, not that many of those people are actually atheists or agnostics. They just have these interesting sort of self-constructed systems of spiritual belief that borrow some things from Christianity and some things from Eastern or New Age ideas and some things that they read on the internet and fan fiction, whatever. But they often have these self-constructed religious identities that aren't clearly secular. But that set aside, that's the story. The issue is that it doesn't actually match what's happening on the ground. While it is true in Europe and Western Europe and America that has been the trend, in other parts of the world, the opposite trend is in play. Countries like China, which is avowedly secular in terms of its government, as it has modernized in the last 50 years, and as it has become more developed and wealthier, you've seen it become increasingly more Christian. Not only that, but of course, in the 20th century, in the early to mid-20th century, we saw the heyday of secularism in places like the Soviet Union, and when it collapsed, what we saw is many, many people re-engaging with religion in different ways. So that, coupled with other things like birth rates, means that everyone who looks at projections of world religions and populations would say that the expectation in the future is that the world is actually going to be more religious, and mostly that means more Christian and Muslim, than it is today. which is a reason for people to think about and engage with religion. It's not going away. I think a lot of people that are secular have this idea that 20 years from now there's not going to be any Christians in the country, or at least that they're all going to be past retirement age. But nothing like that is the case. And globally, it's even less the case. As places like Africa and South America and Asia become more and more prominent on the global stage, that's going to be more and more Christians that people are going to have to rub shoulders with, not less and less. So it's growing. Secondly, Christianity is demonstrably beneficial to people. Christianity is demonstrably beneficial to people in a lot of ways. Now, this one again is kind of shocking because people tend to focus on the ways that religion can do harm. And it is very important for us as Christians to acknowledge that religion can and does do harm at times, including Christianity. People in the name of Christianity have done terrible, terrible things. People in the name of Christianity have excused racism and engaged in violence and perpetuated abuses. And so we should not deny that, nor do we want to engage in some sort of bidding game about net positives. We do want to own those ways that it's hurt the world. But I think that the media and the stories that our culture tells have so focused on those things that it misses the fact that all of the best research would indicate that on the whole, being a committed Christian is massively beneficial to people in their lives. I want to first stress that what we're talking about here is not just identifying as a Christian. 75% of America still identifies as Christian. But there's been a lot of research done on people who are highly religiously engaged, meaning not just that they identify with a religion, but that it's something that is a central part of their lives. It's the most important part of their lives. They're weekly engaging with religious services, things like that. When you look at people like that, sociologists will regularly comment on how remarkably beneficial that sort of religious engagement is on all kinds of metrics. A few years ago, Tyler Vanderweel, who's a Harvard sociologist, published this essay titled "Religion May Be a Miracle Drug," in which he runs through a bunch of these things. And Tyler Vanderweel is not some evangelical Christian trying to spread his faith, but he lays out research showing that Christianity, or those that regularly attended Christian worship services in the U.S., were more optimistic, had lower rates of depression, were less likely to commit suicide, had greater senses of purpose in life, were less likely to divorce, and are more self-controlled, among other things. And in fact, he ends up arguing that if you kind of took all the net positives of the research together and could make everyone in the country become a committed Christian in that sense, which again, you can't do, but if you could kind of extrapolate that out across the country, mortality rates would be reduced by 20 to 30%. Or another example, Jonathan Haidt, who's an atheist, but in his really interesting book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he tries to point out how a lot of the things we value in the Western world are not actually the things that make us happy. And he has this really provocative illustration of this. He says, imagine two people. He says, first imagine Bob. Bob is 35 years old. He's single. He's attractive. He's athletic. He makes $100,000 a year. He lives in sunny Southern California. That's Bob, okay? And then contrast Bob with Mary. Mary is 65 years old. She's married. She's plain looking. She's overweight. She makes $40,000 a year for their whole household, she and her husband together. But she's highly socially involved in the church especially. And she has kidney disease. If you took those two people and put them side by side, all of us would aspire to be Bob, I think, in America. Almost anyone would say, wow, like given those two people, Bob has a lot more of what I want than Mary does. But Haidt says if you take the research and say which of those people is more likely to be happy with their life, the answer is overwhelmingly Mary. Largely just because two connected things, the fact that she is in a stable marriage, and even more than that, the fact that she has high religious involvement, are such predictors of happiness that they outweigh even the health struggles and the poverty and the discrimination that she's faced historically. Not that any of those are good things, not that those things don't matter, but it's a way of illustrating the reality that regardless of whether it's true or not, being highly religiously engaged tends to make people happier and more fulfilled in life, just statistically. Again, That's not a case for Christianity being true. But if that's true, then it's an obvious question of, well, shouldn't you at least consider it? Shouldn't you explore it? 3, a third reason to care is that Christianity provides resources that secularism lacks. Christianity does provide resources that secularism lacks. I think the most striking of these is simply resources in terms of facing death. One of the really bizarre things about our current cultural moment is that pretty much every culture, in order to endure, has to give people a meaningful answer to death. That doesn't mean it has to be the Christian answer. So, for example, in many ancient cultures, honor was a big part of the meaning of life and therefore a meaningful way to die, because you could die honorably. Or in kind of communal cultures, you had the sense that your family continued you on, and so by being a good son, a good brother, sister, a good parent and grandparent, that you were sort of continuing on through your family. And then, of course, there's religions like Christianity that would say that both eternal life in communion with God and life lived to the glory of and service of God has a meaning that transcends death. Modern secular culture really has no good way to engage with death, because it is invested in an ultimate good that is sort of self-realization and self-fulfillment, and because death represents the ultimate dissolving of the self in a secular worldview, it means that we simply have to bury our heads in the sand, largely, and not grapple with the fact that it's coming, or resign ourselves to a sort of inevitability that we try not to think about too hard, but that's always there in the back of your head, kind of haunting you. And so Christianity just provides a more meaningful, fulfilling answer when we think about something like death than the secular culture does. Or another example would be something like forgiveness. It's actually very hard for a lot of modern people, even though they recognize on some level that forgiveness is necessary for us to be able to move forward in the world. It's very hard for them to justify offering it. Instead, there's this temptation to seek justice and even to seek vengeance on anyone that would hurt us, because there is no source of authority and source of justice beyond us that we have to help in. Whereas Christianity, both because we have hope that God is just and will ultimately bring a reckoning for the injustice in the world, and because we have the cross and the resurrection offering us forgiveness for our sins and new life and new identity in Jesus, is able to communicate a system within which we can forgive those who would hurt us, rather than just trying to get our pound of flesh. So that's 3 different reasons to care, and then one more is that Christianity is the best story to explain the human experience, by which I mean also, I think it's true. I'm putting this at the end just to say, first of all, that I don't want us to only give these sorts of answers, because as much as it's true that Christianity has societal benefits and benefits on our lives and gives us certain resources and connects us with other parts of the world, as much as all of that is true, we can't lose sight of the fact that ultimately we're called to believe it because we think it itself is true, because we think that Jesus Christ died for our salvation and rose again on the 3rd day from the grave. And we always want to be sure, even as we're having these discussions about other things with people, to remind them of that fact. Because we're not just talking about another philosophy of life. We're not just talking about an Oprah-esque way to change your outlook on the world. Instead, what we're talking about is something that we claim is historically true, that is cosmically true, and that is unavoidable in a way that we have to reckon with it. That said, as I try to talk about that truth, a lot of times what I try to do with people is to communicate not just that in the abstract, but to say, here's why. And that way that I framed it, that it's the best story to explain the human experience, is often the way that I find myself talking with secular people about this idea. By which I mean this: there are certain things about our experience of the world that I don't think secularism or any other thought system adequately explains. For example, I have this sense that the world is both really beautiful and good and really broken and messed up. That doesn't actually make sense in most worldviews. On the one hand, there are some perspectives that would say the world is good, but then they end up having to excuse sin and brokenness. On the other hand, there are perspectives that say, well, the world's just the way it is and is messed up, but then it's hard for us to say, well, why do we think it should be otherwise? In fact, that's one of the great struggles of secularism in terms of thinking about the world, right? Is to say, if the world isn't moral, if there's not goodness and badness, then why do I have a sense that the world should be better than it is? Christianity speaks directly to that. telling us that we're in a world both created by God, very good, and fallen and broken because of human sin. Or it speaks to me as well in terms of my sense of my place within that beautiful and broken world. I have this clear recognition that the world is broken, but that I'm broken too, that I in some sense am part of the problem. That if I'm really being honest with myself, I recognize that there's people that I have hurt, and there's ways that I am selfish and greedy, and that when I'm talking about a lot of even the big social ills of the world, like global poverty, that in some sense I'm probably complicit in that to some extent. And so I recognize that I'm a part of the problem, and that so therefore I should change, but also that I'm wholly inadequate to change myself. It's interesting sometimes there's this sort of perfectionism that can creep into certain people who really honestly grapple with their place in the world, this non-Christian secular people, and they arrive at this point of deep discouragement because they think, well, I can live my generous, tiny home, carbon neutral, globally just, everything fair trade, listed all down life. But they almost always end up running into the realization that one, even if they can somehow do that, they probably can't also not lose their patience with their kids or gossip about their neighbors all of the time. And so they're still a part of the problem. But two, that usually they can't even do that as much as they try. And that's a way of saying that what we need is a salvation that comes from outside of us. We need something that can both reckon with the fact that we're a part of the problem while also working new life in us. And again, that is the hope of the gospel of Jesus. So there is some food for thought, friends. And I give you all of that with the hopes that those are starting places to begin conversations with people. Again, those aren't the end. Those aren't the destination. We want to move into people's real objections and struggles. But hopefully that's a way of saying that Christianity is something that is provocative and powerful enough in our world that whether you come to believe it or not, it's certainly worth engaging with and caring about.